Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might sound familiar until you realize how utterly alien it actually was. The way medieval people slept, which turns out to be so fundamentally different from anything we do today that it would probably drive most of us completely insane within a week. Picture this. It's 2 a.m., church bells are ringing, and instead of cursing the noise, an entire village is waking up on purpose. Not because of insomnia or Netflix binges, but because that's just how human sleep was supposed to work before we decided to conquer darkness with electricity and ruin everything our ancestors understood about rest. You probably won't survive a single night of authentic medieval sleep between the straw mattresses crawling with mice, the communal beds shared with complete strangers, and the delightful reality that your bedroom also doubled as the family livestock pen. We're talking about a world where your sleeping arrangements could literally kill you, and somehow people found ways to not just survive, but create some of the most intimate and sacred moments of their entire lives. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The church bell tolled twice through the frigid winter air, its bronze voice cutting through the silence of the sleeping village. But Thomas Miller didn't curse the interruption. He had been waiting for it. In the straw-filled alcove that served as his family's bedchamber, he felt his wife Agnes stir beside him, her breathing shifting from the deep rhythm of slumber to the lighter cadence of wakefulness. This was the Watch, and like every other soul in medieval Europe, they knew exactly what to do. The stone walls of their humble dwelling seemed to exhale cold, despite the dying embers in the central hearth. Thomas could see his breath in the pale moonlight filtering through the oiled parchment that covered their single window. Beside him, little Margot remained deep in her first sleep, her small body curled against her mother's warmth, like a kitten seeking shelter. The child would not wake for another hour. Her young body still followed the ancient rhythm that adults had learned to trust without question. Agnes reached for the rough woolen cloak they kept at the foot of their straw mattress, wrapping it around her shoulders as she sat up. Her movements were practiced, silent, reverent even. This wasn't exhaustion forcing them awake. This was nature's design, as predictable as sunrise and just as sacred. For the past 4 hours, since sunset prayers at 7, they had enjoyed what their ancestors called first sleep, a deep restorative slumber that carried them through the darkest part of the night. Now came the gift hidden within winter's long darkness, the Watch. Thomas felt his mind clear and sharpen in a way that never happened during daylight hours. His body felt rested, renewed, ready for the quiet tasks that belong to this sacred time between sleeps. He rose carefully, his bare feet finding the cold stone floor, and moved toward the glowing coals that would need tending if his family was to survive until dawn. The Watch belonged to God, Agnes had always believed, and she used these precious hours accordingly. While Thomas coaxed the fire back to life, she knelt on the straw and began her night prayers, her whispered Latin mixing with the crack and hiss of kindling. These weren't the hurried morning prayers said while rushing to daily labor, nor the exhausted evening prayers mumbled through drowsy lips. These prayers came from a mind at peace, a body restored, a soul ready to commune with the divine. Outside, Thomas could hear the village coming alive in its own quiet way. A cow lowed softly in someone's byre, probably old Henrik checking his animals, making sure they hadn't wandered or fallen ill in the cold. The Watch was when livestock received their most careful attention, when fires were banked against the brutal winter wind, when night soil was emptied and fresh straw laid down. These weren't chores. They were rituals of survival that connected every villager to the rhythm of creation itself. But the watch held other gifts as well. When Agnes finished her prayers, he moved to where Thomas sat by the rebuilt fire, and they shared something that daylight rarely permitted: unhurried intimacy. Medieval physicians wrote that the body was most balanced during these night hours, the humors perfectly aligned, the mind calm and receptive. Whether they spoke softly of their hopes for Margot's future, shared gentle touches warmed by firelight, or simply sat in comfortable silence, these moments belonged entirely to them. Thomas found his thoughts turning to the mysteries that daylight scattered. In the watch, he could ponder questions that seemed foolish under the sun's harsh glare. What lay beyond the village boundaries? What wisdom did the old stories carry? How would the world change for his daughter? His grandfather had told him that some men used the watch for reading, those blessed few who possessed both books and the skill to decipher them. Thomas couldn't read, but he could think, and thinking in the quiet hours felt almost like prayer itself. Agnes checked little Margot, adjusting the child's woolen cap and ensuring she remained warm beneath their shared blankets. Soon, perhaps when the bell tolled 3, they would return to their straw mattress for second sleep, the final rest that would carry them until dawn. But not yet. The watch still held them in its gentle embrace, offering a peace that their ancestors understood, but that future generations would abandon in their rush toward endless light. As Thomas banked the fire for the night's remainder, and Agnes completed her final prayers, neither questioned the rhythm that governed their lives. They had never known 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, had never imagined that darkness could be conquered entirely. The watch was their inheritance from generations past, and their gift to generations future, a reminder that even in the depths of winter's cold, humanity could find warmth, purpose, and the quiet contentment that comes from living in harmony with time itself. The bell would not sound again until dawn. The scratching began just as John Miller settled into what he generously called sleep. Tiny claws scurried through the straw beneath his back, accompanied by the distinctive rustle that meant his family's bedding had acquired new tenants. Again. A sharp bite on his ankle confirmed what he already knew. The fleas had returned with reinforcements, and tonight's rest would be another battle in the endless war between human comfort and medieval reality. In the dim corner of their single-room cottage, separated from the main living space by nothing more than a moth-eaten woolen curtain, the Miller family's sleeping arrangement defied every modern notion of privacy or peace. John lay squeezed between his wife Margaret and their eldest son Robert, while their 3 younger children formed a wiggling, breathing tangle at their feet. The bed beneath them was a testament to human ingenuity born of desperation, a wooden frame that John had cobbled together from discarded cart planks, supporting a canvas sack stuffed with whatever straw they could gather from the harvest fields. The straw, John reflected as something with too many legs explored his ribcage, that seemed like such a good idea in September. Fresh, dry, sweet-smelling, it had transformed their sleeping corner into something approaching comfort. But winter had taught him cruel lessons about organic bedding. The straw had compressed under their combined weight, creating valleys and peaks that guaranteed someone would wake with a crick in their neck. Worse, it had absorbed every drop of moisture from their breath, their bodies, and the perpetual dampness that seeped through the stone walls, creating a perfectly humid environment for creatures that bit, crawled, and multiplied. Margaret stirred beside him, her hand instinctively moving to scratch at something near her shoulder. She had learned, as they all had, to scratch quietly. Violent movements only scattered the fleas to new territory, and their youngest, little Anne, was finally sleeping soundly after hours of feverish coughing. The child had been fighting some nameless ailment for days, the kind of sickness that medieval parents faced with prayer, herbs, and the terrible knowledge that some battles couldn't be won. A particularly bold mouse decided that John's hip made an excellent launching pad for whatever nocturnal business mice conducted in family beds. John felt the tiny creature's claws dig in briefly before it disappeared back into the rustling darkness of their bedding. He had long ago abandoned any thought of evicting the mice. They were probably warmer than his family was, and their body heat, however minimal, was body heat nonetheless. Besides, they mostly kept to themselves, unlike the fleas that treated human flesh as an all-night buffet. The wooden frame creaked ominously as Robert rolled over in his sleep, reminding John of his constant fear that the entire contraption would collapse and dump his family onto the cold stone floor. He had elevated their straw mattress partly to avoid the dampness that crept across the ground, but mostly because sleeping directly on the floor felt too much like surrendering to poverty entirely. The frame was his small act of rebellion against a world that seemed determined to reduce him to the level of livestock. Above their heads, the thatched roof whispered with the movement of other creatures, rats probably, or birds that had found their way into the eaves. John tried not to think about what might fall through the thatch during the night. Their neighbor had once awakened to find a dead pigeon on his chest, and the story had become village legend, told with the kind of dark humor that helped people cope with lives that offered little conventional comfort. Little Anne coughed again, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls and sent a chill through John's heart that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Margaret's breathing changed. She was awake now, listening with a mother's practiced ear to determine whether the cough meant immediate danger or just another restless night. The decision was made in silence. Margaret's hand found Anne's forehead, checking for fever, while John strained to hear any change in the child's breathing that might signal the need for desperate action. The straw beneath them rustled and shifted as their movements redistributed weight and displaced whatever creatures called their bedding home. John thought of the soft feather mattresses he had glimpsed in the manor house, the clean linens and carved bed frames that existed in a world so far removed from his own that they might as well have been tales from fairy stories. Those beds belonged to people who had never shared their sleep with mice, never awakened to flea bites covering their arms like a pox, never wondered whether their children would survive until morning. But as Anne's breathing steadied and Margaret's hand relaxed on his arm, John found himself oddly grateful for this chaotic, uncomfortable, utterly unglamorous arrangement. Their bed wasn't about comfort. It was about survival, warmth, and the simple fact that when dawn came, they would face another day together. The rustling of straw beneath them became a lullaby of endurance, a reminder that his family had made it through another night in a world that offered no guarantees except the promise of another chance to try again tomorrow. Lady Margaret de Blackwood pulled the ridiculous pointed cap down over her ears and tried to convince herself that dignity and survival could coexist. The hat looked absurd. She knew this without needing a mirror. Stretching nearly 2 feet above her head in a cone of thick wool that made her resemble some sort of domesticated wizard. But as the December wind howled through the stone corridors of Blackwood Castle, rattling the heavy tapestries and finding every gap in the ancient masonry, Margaret had learned to value warmth over vanity. 3 months into her marriage, she was still discovering the harsh realities of medieval castle life. The romantic stories told by traveling minstrels had somehow omitted crucial details about stone walls that never truly warmed, fireplaces that heated only the few feet directly in front of them, and drafts that could freeze wine solid in goblets placed too far from the hearth. Her childhood home had been smaller, humbler, but its timber walls had offered some mercy against the elements. Blackwood Castle, for all its imposing grandeur, seemed designed by someone who had never actually planned to live through a winter. Margaret's maid had giggled when first presenting the nightcap, explaining it as a curious local custom. The previous Lady Blackwood had worn one, as had her mother before her and her grandmother before that. At first, Margaret had assumed it was some quaint family tradition, like the peculiar blessing they spoke over bread or the way they hung garlic above doorways. But her first night sleeping without the cap had taught her a lesson in medieval physics that no amount of noble breeding could overcome. Heat escaped through the head faster than through any other part of the body. This was accepted medical knowledge, confirmed by physicians who had studied in Paris and translated ancient Greek texts. When Margaret had awakened that first bare-headed morning, with her hair literally frozen to the pillow, she understood why generations of sensible women had embraced headwear that looked like architectural accidents. The nightcap wasn't fashion, it was science disguised as silliness. The castle's master chamber, which should have been the warmest room in the fortress, remained stubbornly resistant to human comfort. The massive four-poster bed, carved from oak and hung with velvet curtains, was beautiful enough to inspire visiting nobles to fits of envy. But beauty provided little insulation against the relentless cold that seeped through walls 3 feet thick. Margaret had tried sleeping with the bed curtains drawn tight, creating a small enclosed space that trapped her breath and body heat, but even that medieval innovation couldn't compete with a winter that seemed determined to turn her bedchamber into a tomb. The nightcap had become her secret weapon in this daily battle for survival. Made from wool so thick it could probably stop arrows, lined with fur that some unfortunate rabbit had donated to the cause, and designed with flaps that covered her ears completely. It transformed her from elegant young bride into something resembling a well-dressed scarecrow. But when she woke each morning with feelings still in her fingers and toes, Margaret found herself developing a genuine affection for her ridiculous headwear. Tonight promised to be particularly brutal. Snow had been falling since afternoon, and the wind carried that bone-deep chill that meant the temperature would drop far below anything humans were meant to endure. Margaret had watched the servants banking fires throughout the castle, adding extra logs and adjusting dampers with the expertise of people who understood that tonight's preparations might determine tomorrow's casualties. Even the dogs had retreated from their usual posts, seeking warmth in kitchens and stables where human activity generated precious heat. As Margaret prepared for bed, pulling on the layers of wool and linen that medieval ladies used to armor themselves against the night, she caught sight of herself in the polished metal that served as a mirror. The nightcap, combined with her woolen bedrobe and thick stockings, created a silhouette that bore no resemblance to the graceful maiden depicted in courtly poetry. She looked like a walking bundle of fabric, topped with an architectural experiment, but she also looked like someone who intended to survive until morning. The wind outside intensified, sending something heavy, probably a shutter, crashing against the castle walls. Margaret climbed into bed and pulled the heavy fur coverlets up to her chin, grateful for every layer between her and the malevolent cold. The nightcap settled around her head like a woolen embrace, trapping the warmth rising from her body and creating a small pocket of humanity in an inhospitable world. As she settled into the bed that was both symbol of her status and fortress against the elements, Margaret realized she was learning something profound about survival and dignity. The nightcap might make her look foolish, but it also represented generations of practical wisdom passed down from women who had faced these same brutal winters and lived to pass on their knowledge. There was honor in adaptation, grace in accepting that sometimes the most sensible choice looked completely ridiculous to anyone who hadn't faced the alternative. The wind continued its assault on the castle walls, but Margaret fell asleep warm and grateful, her pointed woolen hat standing guard over dreams of spring. William the cloth merchant opened his eyes to find three strangers breathing directly into his face, their collective exhalations creating a warm but thoroughly unpleasant fog in the cramped confines of the prancing pony's communal bed. To his left, a burly man with blackened teeth was grinding his jaw in sleep, producing sounds that suggested he was either chewing imaginary food or preparing to devour his bedmates. To his right, someone had apparently decided that midnight was the perfect time to release digestive gases that could probably strip paint, if paint had been invented yet. The inn bed, generous in its medieval interpretation, could theoretically accommodate 4 travelers, though comfort had clearly never been part of the arrangement. William found himself wedged between unwashed bodies, his expensive Flemish woolens mingling with rough homespun and leather that smelled of horse sweat and questionable hygiene practices. His carefully protected bundle of silk samples was tucked beneath his body, serving the dual purpose of pillow and burglar alarm. If anyone tried to steal his merchandise, the resulting shift in weight would wake him instantly. Privacy, William had learned during his 3 days at the Prancing Pony, was a rare commodity, was a luxury concept that hadn't reached English roadside inns. When he had requested a room for himself, the innkeeper had looked at him as though he'd asked for a personal cathedral. Beds were shared resources, like wells or grinding stones, and the idea of one person occupying an entire sleeping space struck the locals as both wasteful and deeply suspicious. Only lepers and madmen slept alone, and William appeared to be neither. His current bedmates represented a cross-section of England's traveling population. The tooth grinder introduced himself as Edmund the baker, hauling flour to market towns along the York Road. The gas producer went by Harold and claimed to be a leather worker, though his hands suggested he dealt more with manure than hide. The third man, pressed against the far wall, had given his name as Brother Francis and wore the rough brown habit of a Franciscan friar, though his snoring rivaled anything produced in less holy establishments. Sleep had been an optimistic goal rather than an achievable reality. Edmund's jaw grinding created a rhythm that made William think of millstones crushing grain, while Harold's digestive symphony provided percussion that would have impressed traveling musicians. Brother Francis contributed a nasal melody that seemed designed to wake the dead, or at least every other guest at the Prancing Pony. William lay rigid between them, one hand on his knife handle and the other protecting his money pouch, wondering how highway robbery had come to seem like a more appealing alternative to shared accommodation. The straw mattress beneath them had long ago surrendered any pretense of providing comfort or support. What remained felt like sleeping on a collection of broken sticks wrapped in rough canvas, with mysterious lumps that shifted when pressed and produced unsettling sounds when disturbed. William suspected that previous guests had contributed personal items to the mattress filling, accidentally or otherwise, and that archaeologists of future centuries might find the bed's contents fascinating. Around midnight, Harold began what appeared to be a conversation with invisible companions, muttering about overdue debts and unfaithful wives, while gesturing emphatically with hands that came dangerously close to William's face. Brother Francis responded to this unconscious discourse by rolling over and throwing an arm across Edmund's chest, causing the baker to incorporate the additional weight into his grinding rhythm without missing a beat. William's paranoia reached its peak when he noticed Harold's hand slowly moving toward what appeared to be a knife handle protruding from his belt. Every merchant's nightmare flashed through William's mind. Stories of travelers who accepted hospitality, only to wake up poorer or not at all. His own blade was half drawn before Harold's movements resolved into something altogether more mundane. The man was cutting a piece of hard bread for what appeared to be a midnight snack, chewing it with the methodical determination of someone accustomed to meals that required serious jaw work. The realization that he had nearly started a knife fight over a piece of bread struck William as both ridiculous and sobering. His merchant's training in evaluating character had been warped by exhaustion and unfamiliar circumstances, turning fellow travelers into potential threats. These men weren't highway robbers. They were simply people trying to make their way in a world where comfortable sleep was a luxury few could afford. As dawn approached and the inn began stirring with the sounds of early risers, William found himself oddly grateful for his uncomfortable night. His bedmates had shared their warmth, their stories, and their protective presence against whatever real dangers might lurk along dark roads. Harold offered him bread from his dwindling supply. Edmund shared gossip about market conditions ahead, and Brother Francis provided a blessing for safe travels that seemed entirely sincere. The breathing that had seemed so intrusive in darkness now felt like the rhythm of shared humanity, reminding William that trust might be the most valuable commodity any traveler could carry. Brother Augustine awakened not to the bells of matins, but to the sharp bite of a flea drilling into his ankle with the persistence of a tiny demon. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, dedicating his life to spiritual purity while sharing his bed with creatures that seemed to exist solely to torment the faithful. In the dormitory of Canterbury's Benedictine Monastery, 60 monks lay in neat rows like human sardines, each wrestling with his own collection of nocturnal tormentors while maintaining the vow of silence that governed their nighttime hours. The wooden plank that served as Augustine's bed would have made a medieval peasant weep with envy, not for its comfort, which was non-existent, but for its sheer austerity. A thin straw mattress, barely thicker than parchment, separated his body from wood that had been chosen specifically for its ability to discourage restful sleep. The monastery's founders understood that comfort bred complacency, and complacency was the enemy of spiritual discipline. If Augustine wanted softness, he could find it in prayer, not in bedding. Tonight's symphony of suffering included not just his own flea bites, but the collective sounds of 60 men attempting to sleep while insects treated their flesh like an all-night feast. The vow of silence meant that no one could complain, curse, or even sigh too loudly when something with too many legs explored their person. Instead, the dormitory filled with the subtle sounds of spiritual endurance, the soft scratch of fingernails against wool habits, the barely audible rustle of straw as someone tried to find a position that offered momentary relief, and the whispered prayers of men who had learned to find meaning in discomfort. Augustine had been at Canterbury for 3 months, long enough to understand that his romantic notions about monastic life had been laughably naive. He had envisioned long hours of peaceful contemplation, meaningful work copying sacred texts, and the deep satisfaction of a life devoted to God's service. What he hadn't anticipated was the constant, grinding reality of physical misery that accompanied spiritual devotion. The fleas were just one element in a comprehensive program of bodily mortification that included inadequate food, insufficient warmth, and sleeping arrangements that seemed designed by someone who viewed human comfort as a sin against divine providence. The monastery's rule of Saint Benedict specified that monks should sleep fully clothed, ready to rise instantly for the night prayers that marked the rhythm of their devotion. Augustine wore his rough wool habit, his leather belt, and even his sandals to bed, creating a costume that trapped heat, scratch-sensitive skin, and provided ideal nesting grounds for insects. The wool, though practical for warmth, had apparently been woven specifically to irritate human flesh, a spiritual hair shirt disguised as daily wear. Brother Marcus, sleeping to Augustine's right, had developed a technique for dealing with the flea invasion that bordered on mystical. Rather than scratch or swat, he remained perfectly still, allowing the creatures to feast while he offered their bites as prayer intentions. Augustine had watched in amazement as Marcus endured what appeared to be a coordinated assault by an entire flea battalion without so much as twitching. When asked about his method, Marcus had simply quoted scripture, "In all things give thanks, for this is the will of God." The cold added another layer to Augustine's nighttime trials. Canterbury's dormitory had been designed with spiritual priorities rather than human comfort in mind, featuring high ceilings that allowed heat to escape, stone walls that absorbed and radiated cold, and windows that admitted drafts with the enthusiasm of architectural enemies. Augustine's breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air, and he had learned to sleep with his hands tucked inside his habit to prevent his fingers from going completely numb. But somewhere between the flea bites and the bone-deep cold, Augustine began to understand something that his theology lessons had never quite captured. This wasn't random suffering. This was transformation. Each insect bite became an opportunity to practice patience. Each shiver, a chance to contemplate the temporary nature of physical existence. The fleas weren't demons sent to torment him. They were tiny teachers, instructing him in the art of finding peace within discomfort. As the bell tower chimed 2 o'clock and the call to matins echoed through the dormitory, Augustine rose with his brothers, his body aching but his spirit oddly refreshed. The night's collection of bites, scratches, and shivers had become offerings, small sacrifices that connected him to something larger than personal comfort. He had learned to find grace in the spaces between flea bites, holiness in the rhythm of shared suffering, and strange contentment in the knowledge that this difficult path led somewhere worth going. The fleas would return tomorrow night, along with the cold, the discomfort, and the challenge of finding God in circumstances that seemed designed to obscure divine presence. But Augustine was beginning to suspect that this was precisely the point, that true rest existed not in the body's comfort, but in the soul's surrender to something infinitely larger than physical ease. Brother Augustine awakened not to the bells of matins, but to the sharp bite of a flea drilling into his ankle with the persistence of a tiny demon. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, dedicating his life to spiritual purity, while sharing his bed with creatures that seemed to exist solely to torment the faithful. In the dormitory of Canterbury's Benedictine Monastery, 60 monks lay in neat rows like human sardines, each wrestling with his own collection of nocturnal tormentors, while maintaining the vow of silence that governed their nighttime hours. The wooden plank that served as Augustine's bed would have made a medieval peasant weep with envy, not for its comfort, which was non-existent, but for its sheer austerity. A thin straw mattress, barely thicker than parchment, separated his body from wood that had been chosen specifically for its ability to discourage restful sleep. The monastery's founders understood that comfort bred complacency, and complacency was the enemy of spiritual discipline. If Augustine wanted softness, he could find it in prayer, not in bedding. Around him, the dormitory breathed with the collective rhythm of men attempting sleep, while insects treated their flesh like an all-night feast. The vow of silence meant that no one could complain, curse, or even sigh too loudly when something with too many legs explored their person. Instead, the space filled with the subtle sounds of spiritual endurance, the soft scratch of fingernails against wool habits, the barely audible rustle of straw as someone sought momentary relief, and the whispered prayers of men who had learned to find meaning in discomfort. Augustine had been at Canterbury for 8 months, long enough to understand that his romantic notions about monastic life had been laughably naive. He had envisioned long hours of peaceful contemplation, meaningful work copying sacred texts, and the deep satisfaction of a life devoted to God's service. What he hadn't anticipated was the constant, grinding reality of physical misery that accompanied spiritual devotion. The fleas were just one element in a comprehensive program of bodily mortification that included inadequate food, insufficient warmth, and sleeping arrangements that seemed designed by someone who viewed human comfort as a sin against divine providence. The monastery's rule of Saint Benedict specified that monks should sleep fully clothed, ready to rise instantly for the night prayers that marked the rhythm of their devotion. Augustine wore his rough wool habit, leather belt, and even his sandals to bed, creating a costume that trapped heat, scratched sensitive skin, and provided ideal nesting grounds for insects. The wool, though practical for warmth, had apparently been woven specifically to irritate human flesh, a spiritual hair shirt disguised as daily wear. Tonight, however, something shifted in Augustine's understanding. As another flea found the tender skin behind his ear, instead of the familiar surge of frustration, he felt something approaching gratitude. The tiny creature was teaching him patience more effectively than any sermon, forcing him to practice the virtue of acceptance in the most immediate, physical way possible. Each bite became a small meditation on endurance, each itch an invitation to choose spiritual discipline over bodily comfort. Brother Marcus, sleeping to his right, had developed a technique for dealing with the flea invasion that bordered on mystical. Rather than scratch or swat, he remained perfectly still, allowing the creatures to feast while he offered their bites as prayer intentions. Augustine had initially fought this extreme, but watching Marcus's serene expression, even during what appeared to be coordinated insect assaults, he began to understand the wisdom behind such surrender. The cold provided another layer of instruction. Canterbury's dormitory featured stone walls that absorbed heat during the day, only to release it slowly through the night, creating a tomb-like chill that penetrated even the thickest wool. Augustine's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and he had learned to sleep with his hands tucked inside his habit to maintain feeling in his fingers. But even this discomfort carried lessons, reminders of mortality, invitations to contemplation, opportunities to understand that the body's demands need not govern the spirit's peace. As the bell tower chimed the approach of matins, Augustine felt an unexpected surge of anticipation. The call to prayer would interrupt whatever fragments of sleep he had managed, but it would also provide purpose to his wakeful hours, structure to his suffering, and community with his brothers who shared this difficult path. Rising in darkness to chant psalms while exhausted, flea-bitten, and cold was its own form of worship, proof that devotion could transcend physical circumstances. He had learned to find a strange contentment in the rhythm of monastic nights. The fleas would return tomorrow, along with the cold, the hard bed, and the challenge of finding God in circumstances that seemed designed to obscure divine presence. But Augustine was beginning to suspect that this was precisely the point, that true rest existed not in the body's comfort, but in the soul's surrender to something infinitely larger than physical ease. As his brothers stirred around him and the first notes of plain chant began to echo through the stone corridors, Augustine rose to join them, carrying his collection of flea bites like badges of honor, proof that he was learning to find holiness in the most unlikely places. Betty Paris screamed as though her soul was being torn from her body. her 9-year-old frame contorting in ways that defied both anatomy and reason. Her eyes rolled back until only whites showed, and her small hands clawed at invisible tormentors, while she babbled in languages that no child in Salem Village should have known. Across the room, her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams, mirrored the grotesque performance, barking like a dog one moment and weeping like a lost spirit the next, their synchronized madness filling the parsonage with sounds that would haunt their neighbors' dreams for months to come. Reverend Samuel Parris stood frozen in his own parlor, watching his daughter writhe on the floor, while his world cracked apart like ice on a winter pond. The timber walls of the parsonage, which should have provided sanctuary from the harsh Massachusetts winter, now seemed to trap evil rather than exclude it. Through the small diamond-paned windows, snow fell steadily on Salem Village, blanketing the settlement in a purity that mocked the chaos unfolding inside the minister's own home. This was January 1692, and Parris had spent his 49 years building a reputation as a man who could distinguish God's voice from Satan's whispers, but nothing in his theological training had prepared him for this. The attacks had begun weeks earlier as mere oddities, the girls complaining of pinpricks and phantom touches, of feeling invisible hands pulling at their clothes and hair. Salem's inhabitants, accustomed to the daily struggles of frontier life, had initially dismissed such complaints as childhood fancies, or perhaps the effects of too much Bible study during the long winter months. Children in Puritan households were expected to spend endless hours in prayer and scriptural contemplation, and perhaps these particular children had simply strained their minds beyond endurance. But what Parris witnessed now bore no resemblance to overwrought nerves or childhood rebellion. Betty crawled across the floor on her hands and knees, panting like an animal, while making sounds that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than her throat. Abigail stood pressed against the wall, her arms outstretched, as though trying to ward off attackers that only she could see, her voice alternating between terrified whispers and accusations hurled at empty air. Their synchronized movements suggested some invisible choreographer directing their torment, and that choreographer's identity filled Parris with a dread that threatened to unmake his faith entirely. Salem Village in 1692 existed on the ragged edge of civilization, a Puritan community carved from wilderness that remained hostile to human habitation. The settlement had fractured politically and religiously, split between those who embraced the austere commercialism of nearby Salem town and villagers who clung to agricultural traditions and stricter interpretations of Calvinist doctrine. Parris himself had become a lightning rod for these tensions, his sermons growing increasingly militant as he fought to maintain authority over a congregation that questioned his every decision. Now, as he watched his daughter suffer what could only be supernatural assault, he wondered if his enemies had found the ultimate weapon against him. The winter had been particularly brutal, trapping families in close quarters for months, while food supplies dwindled and tempers frayed. In such circumstances, the Puritan mind naturally turned to questions of divine judgment and satanic influence. Why did some families prosper while others suffered? Why did children die while sinners lived? And most terrifyingly, how could faithful Christians distinguish between trials sent by God and torments inflicted by his enemy? These theological puzzles, abstract in warmer seasons, became urgent matters of survival when demons seemed to dance in one's own parlor. Dr. William Griggs arrived that afternoon, summoned by desperate parents who hoped medical knowledge might succeed where prayer had failed. The elderly physician examined both girls with the thoroughness his training demanded, checking for fever, swelling, or any physical manifestation that might explain their condition. He tested their reflexes, examined their pupils, and question them during their calmer moments about what they felt and saw. But when Betty suddenly began speaking in what sounded like Latin, a language no 9-year-old Puritan girl should have known, Griggs stepped back from his patients with the expression of a man confronting forces beyond his expertise. His diagnosis, delivered in the hushed tones reserved for pronouncements that would change everything, fell on the parsonage like a thunderclap. The evil hand is upon them. In that moment, witchcraft ceased being theological speculation and became medical fact, transforming 2 sick children into evidence of supernatural warfare. Salem Village, already strained by political divisions and economic uncertainty, now faced an enemy that could strike anywhere, corrupt anyone, and hide behind the most innocent faces. As darkness fell over the snow-covered village and word of the doctor's conclusion spread from house to house, Salem's residents began the terrible work of looking at their neighbors with new eyes. The children's torment had opened a door that could never be fully closed, unleashing questions that would soon demand answers written in blood. He was a tall man, all in black, and he came to me with a book. Tituba's voice carried across the packed meeting house like thunder rolling over Salem Village, each word falling into a silence so complete that even breathing seemed suspended. The enslaved woman from Barbados stood before her accusers with the dignity of someone who had already calculated the price of truth versus the cost of survival. Her dark hands folded calmly, while the most powerful men in Massachusetts hung on her every syllable. He told me to write my name in his book, to serve him, and he would give me many fine things. The makeshift courtroom buzzed with the electricity of revelation. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin leaned forward on their wooden bench, their faces reflecting the terrible fascination of men witnessing evil confess itself. Behind them, the meeting house filled with villagers who had abandoned their daily labor to hear testimony that promised to explain the supernatural chaos consuming their community. These were farmers and craftsmen who understood practical problems with practical solutions. But Tituba's words painted a reality where the devil himself walked among them, recruiting servants with all the methodical purpose of a military commander. Tituba had not intended to become the star witness in Salem's first witchcraft trial. When the constable arrived at Reverend Parris's parsonage 3 days earlier to arrest her alongside Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, she had planned to deny everything with the stubborn silence that enslaved people learned as survival strategy. But 3 days in Salem's crude jail, probably accompanied by interrogation techniques that colonial records diplomatically omitted, had transformed the West Indian woman's approach from resistance to collaboration. If confession offered the only path through this nightmare, then Tituba would confess in ways that gave her interrogators exactly what they craved, while positioning herself as cooperative witness rather than unrepentant criminal. Her confession unfolded like a masterpiece of strategic storytelling. Yes, she had met the devil, but only after he threatened her with violence for refusing his advances. Yes, she had seen his book, but she had not signed it willingly. Fear alone had guided her hand, and most crucially for Salem's future, yes, she had seen other names already written in that infernal ledger, other witches who served the Dark Master with enthusiasm rather than terror. Tituba painted herself as reluctant participant in a supernatural conspiracy that extended far beyond her own actions, transforming her confession from endpoint into prologue. "I saw Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne with the devil," she continued, her accented English carrying the authority of first-hand witness. "And there were 2 other women from Boston that I did not know." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as villagers absorbed the implications. This was not isolated evil. This was organized warfare against their Puritan community, a coordinated assault by Satan's agents, who might be anyone, anywhere, hiding behind familiar faces while plotting their neighbor's destruction. The details Tituba provided seemed torn from nightmares that reasonable people tried not to remember. She spoke of spectral animals, red cats and yellow birds that served as familiars, carrying messages between witches and their infernal master. She described midnight flights through winter air, supernatural transportation to gatherings where the devil's servants plotted against the faithful. Most chillingly, she testified to seeing the devil in various forms, sometimes the tall man in black, sometimes a hog, sometimes a great dog that walked upright and spoke in human tongues. Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, the afflicted children whose torments had triggered this investigation, provided horrifying punctuation to Tituba's testimony. As she spoke, they writhed and screamed, crying out that they could see the specters of accused witches tormenting them even in the courtroom. When Tituba described the devil's book, Abigail shrieked that she could see it hovering in the air above the witness. When Tituba mentioned the other witches, Betty convulsed as though invisible hands were strangling her. Their synchronized suffering provided visual confirmation of Tituba's every word, transforming her confession from mere testimony into divine revelation witnessed by all present. Magistrate Hathorne pressed for more details with the intensity of a prosecutor who sensed unprecedented opportunity. How many witches served the devil? Where did they meet? What evil had they planned against Salem's righteous inhabitants? Tituba's answers painted an increasingly elaborate picture of supernatural conspiracy, each revelation expanding the scope of potential threat while deepening the community's paranoia. She had opened a door that revealed not just individual wickedness, but systemic corruption, suggesting that evil had infiltrated their society so thoroughly that anyone might be suspect. As Tituba's confession continued through the long winter afternoon, Salem Village found itself transformed from a community investigating specific accusations into a settlement under siege by invisible enemies. The enslaved woman's strategic cooperation had achieved its immediate goal. She would be spared execution as reward for her testimony. But her words had also unleashed forces that would soon consume far more than 3 accused women. The Devil's Book, according to Tituba, contained many names, and Salem would not rest until every signature had been revealed, no matter how many neighbors had to die in the process of purging evil from their midst. The gavel fell in the sweltering heat of Salem town's makeshift courthouse, and with that sound, spectral evidence, testimony about dreams, visions, and invisible torments became as legally binding as a signed confession. Chief Justice William Stoughton surveyed the packed courtroom with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was conducting divine business, his black robes lending additional gravity to proceedings that had already transcended normal legal boundaries. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, established by Governor William Phipps in May 1692, operated under rules that would have seemed fantastical anywhere except a community convinced that Satan himself had declared war on their Puritan experiment. Bridget Bishop stood in the dock like a woman who had spent 60 years refusing to apologize for her existence. Her bright red bodice, a defiant splash of color in a courtroom dedicated to finding darkness everywhere. The tavern keeper and occasional fortune teller had lived on Salem's margins long enough to understand that conformity offered the only protection against community suspicion. But Bishop had chosen visibility over safety, prosperity over piety, and now those choices stood as evidence of supernatural allegiance. Her very presence seemed to energize the afflicted girls, who writhed in their designated seats like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Bridget Bishop, you stand accused of practicing witchcraft against the bodies and souls of sundry persons, Stoughton intoned, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. The charges against Bishop read like a catalog of village grudges transformed into supernatural crimes. Cows dying after arguments with their owner, children falling ill after visits to her tavern, strange dolls discovered hidden in cellar walls. What might have been coincidence in another time and place became evidence of maleficent magic in a courtroom where fear had replaced logic as the primary tool of legal reasoning. The testimony unfolded with the theatrical precision of a morality play written by madmen. Witness after witness described encounters with Bishop's specter, her ghostly form visiting them in dreams to pinch, bite, and torment their sleeping bodies, while her physical self maintained perfect alibis. Samuel Gray testified that Bishop's spirit had murdered his child through supernatural means. William Stacy claimed her apparition had stolen money from his pocket during a spectral visit to his bedchamber. Mary Warren, herself recently accused and narrowly escaped hanging, sobbed as she described seeing Bishop's specter commanding an army of familiars to attack innocent Christians. The afflicted girls provided a horrifying chorus to each accusation, their bodies contorting in apparent agony whenever Bishop's name was mentioned or her gaze fell upon them. Ann Putnam Jr. shrieked that she could see Bishop's yellow bird perched on the courtroom beam, ready to attack anyone who challenged its mistress. Mercy Lewis collapsed as though struck by invisible blows, crying out that Bishop's specter was choking her, even as the accused woman stood motionless in chains. Their performances had evolved since the trials began, growing more elaborate and synchronized, as though they were actors who had rehearsed their roles to perfection. Stoughton and his fellow magistrates accepted every vision as fact, every spectral sighting as concrete evidence. The legal precedent they established was breathtaking in its implications. If someone claimed to have been harmed by another person's spirit, that testimony alone justified conviction for witchcraft. The accused could offer no meaningful defense against such charges. How could one prove that their spirit had not committed crimes while their body slept? How could witnesses cross-examine a ghost? The court had created a legal framework where accusation and conviction became virtually synonymous. The physical evidence against Bishop seemed equally damning to minds primed to see evil everywhere. Searchers examining her body reported finding witches' teats, unusual marks that supposedly fed supernatural familiars. Workmen renovating her former home claimed to have discovered poppets, small dolls stuck with pins that allegedly caused sympathetic harm to their human targets. That such dolls might have innocent explanations, that unusual skin marks occurred naturally on aging bodies, that coincidence could explain seemingly supernatural events. These possibilities found no audience in a courtroom dedicated to confirming preconceived beliefs about satanic conspiracy. Bishop's own defense, delivered in the forthright manner of someone who had never learned diplomatic speech, probably sealed her fate more effectively than any testimony against her. She denied the charges with the bluntness of innocence, showing none of the careful theological language that might have convinced Puritan magistrates of her piety. When asked about the dolls found in her walls, she expressed genuine bewilderment rather than humble submission to divine judgment. Her very refusal to confess became evidence of stubborn alliance with evil. Truly repentant souls would surely acknowledge their sins and throw themselves on the court's mercy. The verdict surprised no one who had watched Stoughton's face during the proceedings. Guilty on all charges. The sentence followed with mechanical inevitability: death by hanging. As Bishop was led away to await execution, the courtroom buzzed with the satisfaction of a community that believed it had struck a decisive blow against supernatural enemies. The precedent was established, the machinery of death was in motion, and Salem's appetite for finding witches had only begun to grow. Bridget Bishop would hang within the week, but her death would not satisfy the hunger her trial had awakened. It would only prove that the court's methods worked, encouraging more accusations and ensuring that the gallows would not long remain empty. Rebecca Nurse climbed the rough wooden steps to Gallows Hill with the slow dignity of a woman who had spent 71 years earning her neighbors' respect, only to watch it crumble under the weight of spectral accusations and community hysteria. The crowd that gathered to witness her execution on July 19, 1692, included many who had known her since childhood, who had sought her counsel during difficult births, who had benefited from her quiet charity during harsh winters. Now they watched in uncomfortable silence as the rope was fitted around the neck of Salem Village's most beloved matriarch, their unease a testament to how far their community had traveled from the path of reason. Standing beside Rebecca on the gallows platform were 4 other women whose only common crime was inhabiting a world where fear had displaced justice. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar whose bitter tongue had made her an easy target for supernatural accusations. Elizabeth Howe, the blind woman whose disability had somehow transformed into evidence of evil alliance. Susanna Martin, whose sharp wit had been reinterpreted as demonic influence. Sarah Wilds, whose family disputes had escalated into capital charges. Together, they represented the expanding definition of witchcraft that now encompassed everything from poverty to intelligence, from physical difference to social nonconformity. The journey to this moment had begun 2 months earlier when Ann Putnam Jr., one of Salem's most prolific accusers, had pointed her finger at Rebecca Nurse during a particularly dramatic fit. The accusation had sent shockwaves through Salem Village. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then no one was safe from suspicion. Here was a woman who had raised 8 children with patience and love, who had nursed sick neighbors without regard for personal risk, whose very presence in their meeting house had seemed to sanctify the space she occupied. The idea that such a woman served Satan challenged everything Salem's residents thought they knew about good and evil. The initial jury had struggled with Rebecca's case in ways that revealed the arbitrary nature of spectral evidence. During her trial, the afflicted girls had performed their usual theatrics, writhing and screaming as though Rebecca's very gaze inflicted physical torment. But when the jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty, something unprecedented happened. Rebecca Nurse's neighbors erupted in applause, breaking the solemn decorum that typically characterized witch trials. For a brief moment, it seemed that community sanity might prevail over judicial madness. That moment of hope died when Chief Justice Stoughton intervened, expressing his dissatisfaction with the verdict and demanding that the jury reconsider their decision. Under pressure from the court and faced with renewed performances from the afflicted girls, the jurors reluctantly reversed their verdict. Rebecca Nurse's fate was sealed not by evidence of wrongdoing, but by a legal system that had become addicted to confirming its own terrible logic. The message was clear. Acquittals would not be tolerated in Salem's war against supernatural enemies. Mary Easty, Rebecca's sister, had penned a petition from her jail cell that cut through the hysteria with devastating clarity. "I petition your honors not for my own life, for I know I must die, and my appointed time is set. But if it be possible, that no more innocent blood be shed." Her words carried the moral authority of someone facing death without hope of reprieve, someone whose only remaining concern was preventing future injustice. The petition had circulated among Salem's leaders like a ghost of conscience, its reasoned arguments standing in stark contrast to the fevered accusations that drove the trials forward. As Rebecca Nurse spoke her final words, proclaiming her innocence with the quiet conviction that had characterized her entire life, many in the crowd began to weep openly. They were witnessing not just an execution, but the death of their community's moral center. If Salem could hang Rebecca Nurse, if their legal system could transform virtue into vice and charity into witchcraft, then the very foundations of their society had cracked beyond repair. The tears on Gallows Hill that day watered seeds of doubt that would eventually blossom into widespread opposition to the trials. The hangman's rope that silenced Rebecca Nurse also marked the beginning of Salem's awakening from its nightmare of fear. Her death was so obviously unjust, so clearly the result of corrupted legal processes and mass hysteria, that even the most ardent supporters of the witch trials began to question their methods. When righteous women could be condemned on the basis of teenage girls' performances and invisible evidence, when community pillars could be transformed into agents of evil through nothing more than pointed fingers and supernatural speculation, then something had gone fundamentally wrong with their pursuit of justice. As the bodies were cut down and carted away for burial in unmarked graves, even in death, convicted witches were denied the dignity of proper interment. Salem Village faced a reckoning with the monster it had created. The gallows that had consumed Rebecca Nurse and her companions stood as a monument to collective madness, but also as a warning about the price of abandoning reason in favor of fear. The innocent blood spilled on July 19, 1692, would cry out from the ground until Salem found the courage to admit its terrible mistake and seek whatever redemption remained possible. The accusation against Mary Phipps, wife of Massachusetts Governor William Phipps, arrived like a thunderbolt that shattered the last illusions about Salem's witch trials remaining a manageable local crisis. When word reached the governor in October 1692 that his own wife had been named as a servant of Satan, the supernatural conspiracy that had begun with marginalized women and enslaved people suddenly threatened the very pinnacle of colonial society. Phipps, who had established the court of Oyer and Terminer to expedite witch trials and restore order to his troubled province, now faced the uncomfortable reality that the machinery he had created was devouring everything in its path, including his own family. The accusation of the governor's wife represented the logical endpoint of a process that had spiraled beyond all reasonable bounds. What had begun as investigations into the afflictions of a few village children had metastasized into a colony-wide paranoia that recognized no boundaries of class, piety, or social standing. If Mary Phipps could be accused, then literally anyone in Massachusetts might find themselves facing charges of supernatural alliance. The arbitrary nature of spectral evidence, which the court had embraced as divine revelation, now revealed itself as a weapon that could target friend and foe with equal efficiency. Increase Mather, one of New England's most respected theologians and father of Cotton Mather, chose this moment to break his careful silence about the trial's methods. His essay, Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, circulated through Boston like wildfire, challenging the fundamental legal premise that had made Salem's executions possible. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, Mather argued, than that one innocent person should be condemned. His words carried devastating implications for a court system that had relied on spectral evidence to secure convictions, suggesting that every hanging might have been a judicial murder disguised as divine justice. The timing of Mather's intervention coincided with a broader collapse of public confidence in the witch trials. Too many respected citizens had been accused, too many obvious innocents had died, and too many observers had begun questioning the theatrical performances of the afflicted girls who had driven the prosecutions forward. The Reverend John Wise of Ipswich had begun preaching sermons that challenged the supernatural interpretations of events, suggesting that natural causes might explain phenomena that had been attributed to diabolic intervention. Even some of the afflicted girls themselves were beginning to recant their testimony, admitting under pressure that they had falsely accused innocent people. Governor Phipps found himself trapped between competing pressures that threatened to destroy his political career regardless of his decisions. If he continued supporting the trials, he faced the prospect of watching his own wife hang for witchcraft while defending a legal system that had clearly run amok. If he intervened to stop the prosecutions, he risked being accused of protecting Satan's servants and undermining the divine mission to purge evil from Massachusetts. The accusations against Mary Phipps had transformed a manageable political problem into an existential crisis that demanded immediate resolution. On October 29, 1692, Phipps took decisive action that effectively ended Salem's reign of terror. He dissolved the Court of Moyer and Terminer, halting all pending witch trials and executions. The governor's proclamation cited concerns about the reliability of spectral evidence and the need for more careful legal procedures. But everyone understood the real motivation. The witch trials had finally threatened someone too powerful to ignore. The machinery of death that had consumed 20 innocent lives ground to a halt, not because justice demanded it, but because political necessity required it. The establishment of a new superior court of judicature in early 1693 marked Salem's tentative return to legal sanity. The new court, while still technically authorized to try witchcraft cases, operated under drastically different rules. Spectral evidence was no longer admissible, meaning that dreams and visions could not be used to convict defendants. The result was immediate and dramatic. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, only 3 resulted in convictions, and even those were quickly reversed or pardoned. The absence of supernatural testimony revealed how little actual evidence had supported Salem's year of executions. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the few officials willing to acknowledge his role in the tragedy, stood before his congregation on January 14, 1697, while his minister read aloud a statement of public repentance. Sewall accepted blame and shame for his participation in the trials, acknowledging that innocent blood had been shed through his decisions. His public confession represented a rare moment of accountability in a community struggling to process its collective guilt and trauma. The witch trials officially ended, but their legacy would haunt Salem for generations. Families of the executed victims petitioned for decades to clear their relatives' names and recover property confiscated during the hysteria. The Massachusetts General Court eventually passed legislation reversing most convictions and providing limited financial compensation, but the emotional and social damage could never be fully repaired. Salem had learned a terrible lesson about the fragility of justice and the ease with which fear could transform neighbors into enemies, but the price of that education had been paid in innocent blood. Fulvia stood in the marble atrium of her family's domus, watching senators and consulars debate the future of Rome, while their wives remained silent in the shadows. And in that moment of crystalline clarity, she decided she would never be relegated to whispered influence and decorative silence. At 16, she possessed the sharp intelligence of the Fulvii bloodline and the calculating ambition that had elevated her plebeian family from obscurity to the heights of Roman society. But what set her apart was her absolute refusal to accept the limitations that Roman tradition imposed on women. While other girls her age practiced weaving and household management, Fulvia studied the art of power with the intensity of a general preparing for war. The year was 67 BCE, and the Roman Republic was devouring itself with the methodical efficiency of a machine designed for self-destruction. Civil wars erupted with seasonal regularity. Powerful men formed and dissolved alliances based on momentary advantage, and the old constitutional restraints that had governed Roman politics for centuries crumbled under the weight of naked ambition. In this chaotic environment, traditional rules became suggestions. Established hierarchies transformed into obstacles to be overcome, and a young woman with exceptional intelligence and unlimited audacity might find opportunities that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, had earned his nickname through his tendency to stammer during public speeches, but his political instincts remained razor-sharp despite his oratorical limitations. He had maneuvered the Fulvii family into proximity with real power, securing consulships, military commands, and the kind of social connections that allowed plebeian families to compete with ancient patrician houses. From him, Fulvia inherited an understanding that politics was performance art backed by violence, that every public gesture carried private consequences, and that success in Rome required the ability to navigate between principle and pragmatism without losing one's soul in the process. The atrium where Fulvia conducted her observations served as both family shrine and political theater. Its walls lined with wax masks of distinguished ancestors, and its floor worn smooth by generations of clients, seeking favor and supplicants offering support. Here she learned to read the subtle signs that revealed more than speeches, how men positioned themselves relative to each other, whose opinions carried weight in whispered conversations, which alliances were genuine and which were temporary conveniences waiting to be discarded. She discovered that power in Rome flowed through personal relationships rather than institutional channels, that loyalty was a commodity to be traded rather than a virtue to be honored, and that successful politicians treated every interaction as a potential weapon or weakness. Roman women of her class were expected to exercise influence indirectly, through husbands and sons, managing households while men managed the state. They could own property, conduct business, and maintain extensive social networks, but their political participation was supposed to remain invisible, their opinions filtered through male relatives who could claim credit for feminine insights. Fulvia observed this system with the detached interest of someone studying a foreign culture, recognizing its rules while rejecting its assumptions about her personal limitations. She would not be content to whisper suggestions into a husband's ear when she could speak directly to power brokers herself. The young men who courted her quickly discovered that Fulvia evaluated potential marriages with the cold calculation of a general assessing strategic alliances. She was beautiful enough to attract senators' sons, wealthy enough to bring substantial dowry, and intelligent enough to enhance any husband's political prospects. But she made it clear that marriage would be a partnership rather than submission. Her suitors found themselves being interviewed about their political ambitions, their views on constitutional reform, and their willingness to share real authority with a wife who intended to be far more than ornamental. Most fled to seek more conventional brides who would not challenge their assumptions about masculine prerogatives. But Rome in the late Republic attracted men who thrived on chaos, who saw traditional limitations as obstacles to be overcome, rather than rules to be obeyed. One such man was Publius Clodius Pulcher, whose patrician birth had been sacrificed for plebeian adoption that would allow him to seek the tribunate of the plebs. Clodius was scandal incarnate, a political arsonist who specialized in turning Roman streets into theaters of violence, while claiming to represent popular interests against aristocratic oppression. When he met Fulvia at a dinner party hosted by mutual friends, the attraction was immediate and mutual, not romance, but recognition between two people who understood that conventional boundaries existed to be shattered. Their courtship unfolded like a diplomatic negotiation between allied powers, each assessing the other's strengths and calculating potential advantages from formal alliance. Clodius needed a wife whose intelligence matched his own, whose family connections could provide political backing, and whose audacity would not be intimidated by the violent world of Roman populist politics. Fulvia needed a husband whose radical agenda aligned with her own revolutionary instincts, whose public platform could amplify her private influence, and whose reputation for breaking rules would provide cover for her own unconventional behavior. As their engagement was announced throughout Roman society, observers recognized that this was not merely a marriage, but a political manifesto. A declaration that two of Rome's most dangerous minds had decided to combine their talents in pursuit of power that would reshape the Republic according to their shared vision. The blood-soaked toga that once belonged to Publius Clodius Pulcher was carried through the Roman Forum like a battle standard, its crimson stains still fresh from the Appian Way, where hired thugs had hacked her husband to death in broad daylight. Fulvia walked behind the makeshift bier with the measured pace of a woman transformed by grief into something far more dangerous than a mourning widow. Her face a mask of controlled fury that promised retribution for those responsible and revolution for a system that had failed to protect her political partner. At 31, she had already buried one husband to Rome's endemic violence, but this time she would not retreat into traditional widowhood. She would weaponize her loss and watch the Republic burn. The crowd that gathered in the Forum represented every element of Rome's urban population that Clodius had championed during his turbulent career. Freed slaves who owed their citizenship to his legislation, shopkeepers who had prospered under his protection, veterans who had received land grants through his advocacy, and the countless dispossessed who had found in his radical populism their only voice in a system dominated by aristocratic privilege. They had loved Clodius not to spite his scandals, but because of them, recognizing in his willingness to break sacred taboos a kinship with their own exclusion from respectable society. Now they watched Fulvia display his mutilated corpse with the same theatrical genius that had made her husband the most feared demagogue of his generation. Fulvia had learned from 5 years of marriage to Clodius that Roman politics was performance art backed by mob violence, that every public gesture carried private consequences, and that effective leadership required the ability to transform personal tragedy into collective rage. As she stood before the assembled crowd, her voice carrying across the packed forum with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for the dead, she painted a picture of her husband's assassination that transcended mere criminal violence and became a symbolic murder of popular sovereignty itself. Titus Annius Milo, the aristocratic thug who had ordered Clodius's death, was not just a political rival, but an enemy of every Roman who dared to challenge elite power. The funeral she orchestrated violated every convention that governed Roman mourning rituals, transforming what should have been private grief into public insurrection. Instead of the dignified cremation appropriate for a man of senatorial rank, Fulvia ordered Clodius's body to be placed on the speaker's platform in the forum, where his wounds could be seen by every citizen who cared to look. She invited the crowd to witness what aristocratic violence had done to their champion, to see the price that reformers paid for challenging a system that protected wealth and birth above merit and justice. Her calculated display of gore and grief created exactly the response she intended: riot. The mob that erupted from Fulvia's funeral staging carried Clodius's body into the Senate House itself, using the sacred building as a funeral pyre that consumed not just her husband's remains, but the very seat of aristocratic authority. As flames devoured the structure where senators had legislated for centuries, Fulvia watched from a safe distance with the satisfaction of someone who had just proved that popular fury, properly directed, could destroy symbols of power that seemed eternal and untouchable. She had not merely buried her husband, she had transformed his death into a declaration of war against the Republic's ruling class. The violence that followed Clodius's funeral established Fulvia as a political force in her own right, someone who could command loyalty and direct action without needing male mediation. The street gangs that had served her husband now looked to her for leadership, recognizing that she possessed both the strategic intelligence to plan effective campaigns and the ruthless determination to see them through to completion. Roman law might not recognize women as independent political actors, but Roman reality acknowledged power wherever it manifested, and Fulvia's ability to unleash controlled chaos made her a player who could not be ignored or dismissed. Her transformation from grieving widow to political operator unfolded with the speed of someone who had been preparing for this moment throughout her marriage. She maintained Claudius's network of supporters, funded their activities through her substantial personal wealth, and provided strategic direction for their campaigns against Milo and his aristocratic allies. When traditional legal channels failed to secure justice for her husband's murder, Milo was eventually acquitted through bribery and intimidation. Fulvia proved that Roman women could pursue alternative forms of justice that were both more immediate and more satisfying than anything courts could provide. The senators who had celebrated Claudius's death as the elimination of a dangerous radical soon discovered that they had created something far more threatening, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything necessary to gain revenge. Fulvia's response to widowhood established precedents that would shape her entire subsequent career, proving that Roman women could wield power directly rather than indirectly, that grief could be transformed into political weapon, and that the Republic's male elite had seriously underestimated the dangers of turning wives into widows and mothers into mourners. As news of the Senate House burning spread throughout the Mediterranean world, observers recognized that Rome had produced something unprecedented. A woman who could command armies of supporters, direct urban warfare, and transform personal loss into public revolution with an effectiveness that matched any male politician of her generation. Fulvia entered the Senate's antechamber with the confidence of someone who had earned her place through blood and calculated audacity. Her second husband, Gaius Scribonius Curio, trailing behind her like a subordinate awaiting instructions, rather than a consul exercising independent authority. The year was 50 BCE, and the Roman Republic teetered on the precipice of civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. But in this marble-walled space where destiny was negotiated in whispers and handshakes, it was Fulvia who commanded attention from senators accustomed to dismissing women as political ornaments. Her presence violated every protocol that governed senatorial dignity, but her influence had become too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to openly challenge. The marriage to Curio had been orchestrated with the same strategic precision that characterized all of Fulvia's major decisions, uniting her tested political networks with his youthful ambition and legal authority. Where her first husband, Claudius, had been a revolutionary who delighted in destroying established order, Curio represented something more subtle and potentially more effective, a rising star within the system who could advance radical agendas through constitutional means. His tribunate of the plebs in 50 BCE provided exactly the platform Fulvia needed to translate her street-level influence into legislative power, transforming mob violence into legal authority while maintaining plausible deniability about her own role in directing events. The senators, who gathered in the antechamber, regarded Fulvia with the mixture of resentment and grudging respect reserved for adversaries who had proven their ability to inflict serious damage on anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. She had burned their sacred meeting house, orchestrated riots that paralyzed the city, and demonstrated that Roman women could exercise political power directly rather than through the traditional channels of masculine mediation. Now she sat among them as an equal participant in negotiations that would determine whether the Republic survived or collapsed into another round of devastating civil war. Curio's public positions aligned perfectly with Caesar's interests, but observant senators recognized that the young tribune's sudden evolution from political moderate to radical populist coincided precisely with his marriage to Fulvia. Her fingerprints were visible in every speech he delivered, every proposal he advanced, and every alliance he forged with Caesar's faction. She had transformed him into a more polished and constitutionally legitimate version of Clodius. Someone who could advance the same agenda of popular sovereignty and aristocratic humiliation, while avoiding the criminal prosecutions that had plagued her first husband's career. The stakes of their political maneuvering extended far beyond personal advancement or even party loyalty. They involved the fundamental question of whether Rome would remain a republic governed by law or transform into an empire ruled by military strongmen. Caesar's conquest of Gaul had made him fabulously wealthy and dangerously popular. But senatorial conservatives led by Cato the Younger and supported by Pompey were determined to destroy him through legal prosecution the moment he returned to private citizen status. Fulvia understood that Caesar's survival required allies willing to use every available weapon, including tribunician vetoes, popular assemblies, and street violence if constitutional methods proved insufficient. Her strategic calculations proved devastatingly accurate when the crisis escalated beyond political theater into actual warfare. Curio's tribunate expired just as Caesar's legions crossed the Rubicon River, transforming constitutional conflict into civil war that would determine the Republic's survival. In this new environment, where armies rather than assemblies decided policy questions, Fulvia's husband volunteered to lead military campaigns that would either secure their faction's victory or eliminate them as threats to eventual peace negotiations. The African expedition that claimed Curio's life represented both the promise and peril of revolutionary politics in an age when military failure meant death rather than mere electoral defeat. Caesar needed allies willing to fight his battles across the Mediterranean world, and Curio's combination of legal authority, popular support, and personal courage made him an ideal candidate for dangerous assignments. But the same qualities that made him valuable to Caesar's cause also made him a target for enemy forces, who understood that eliminating key lieutenants could cripple their leader's strategic options. News of the disaster reached Rome through the grim efficiency of military dispatch riders. Curio dead, his army annihilated, and Caesar's African strategy in ruins. For most Roman wives, such news would have triggered withdrawal into private mourning and grateful acceptance that their political involvement had ended with their husband's death. But Fulvia had never been most Roman wives, and her response to widowhood demonstrated the extent to which she had transcended traditional gender roles in pursuit of power that operated independently of masculine mediation. Rather than retreat from political engagement, she immediately began calculating how Curio's death could be transformed into advantage for their shared cause. His martyrdom for Caesar's faction established her as the living representative of his legacy, someone who could claim both moral authority and practical knowledge about maintaining the popular coalition that had made his tribunate effective. The network she had built, the loyalties she had cultivated, and the reputation she had earned through 2 marriages and 2 strategic widowhoods positioned her perfectly for an even more audacious alliance with the most powerful man in Caesar's inner circle. Mark Antony was watching, and Fulvia was ready to be watched. Fulvia strode through the Roman Forum with a retinue of armed bodyguards that would have impressed a consul, conducting the business of empire, while her husband Mark Antony dallied with Egyptian queens and abandoned the city that had made him master of the world. At 43, she had transcended every limitation that Roman law and custom imposed on women, transforming herself into something unprecedented in the Republic's history, a female ruler exercising direct authority over legions, legislation, and the vast machinery of state that governed the Mediterranean world. The year was 41 BCE, and while Antony chased pleasure and politics in Alexandria, Fulvia had become the unofficial empress of Rome. Her marriage to Antony had represented the culmination of 2 decades spent building political capital through strategic alliances, carefully orchestrated widowhoods, and an absolute refusal to accept the subordinate role that tradition assigned to senatorial wives. Where other women influenced politics through whispered suggestions and domestic manipulation, Fulvia commanded armies, issued edicts, and negotiated with foreign ambassadors as though she possessed constitutional authority rather than borrowed power. Her transformation from grieving widow to imperial regent had unfolded with such calculated precision that even her enemies grudgingly acknowledged her exceptional political skills. The Rome that Fulvia governed in Antony's absence bore little resemblance to the republic that had nurtured her ambitions during its death throes. Caesar's assassination had eliminated the last leader capable of imposing unity on competing factions, leaving the Mediterranean world to be carved up among his successors through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic marriage. The second triumvirate that emerged from this chaos, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, represented an attempt to institutionalize what had previously been informal power sharing among warlords. But the arrangement's stability depended entirely on personal relationships that were already fraying under the pressure of unlimited ambition. Fulvia's position within this new order defied every precedent that governed Roman women's political participation. She received embassies from client kings, managed the distribution of land grants to veteran soldiers, and coordinated military campaigns against enemies who threatened triumviral authority. Her correspondence with provincial governors carried the same weight as official instructions from magistrates, and her recommendations for appointments were treated as commands rather than suggestions. She had achieved something that no Roman woman before her had even attempted: direct exercise of sovereign power without the fiction of masculine mediation. The crisis that would define her legacy emerged from Octavian's land redistribution program, which threatened to dispossess Italian farmers in order to reward soldiers who had fought in the civil wars. Fulvia recognized immediately that this policy represented both moral outrage and political opportunity. Thousands of displaced families would become natural allies for any leader willing to defend their property rights against triumviral confiscation. When Antony's brother Lucius Antonius was elected consul for 41 BCE, Fulvia saw the perfect instrument for transforming popular discontent into organized resistance against Octavian's increasingly autocratic behavior. The Perusian War that followed represented Fulvia's boldest gamble, an attempt to prove that a woman could lead military campaigns as effectively as any male commander in Roman history. Working closely with Lucius Antonius, she raised 8 legions composed primarily of dispossessed farmers and veterans loyal to Antony's faction, transforming what might have been scattered protests into coordinated rebellion against Octavian's authority. Ancient sources suggest that Fulvia's role extended far beyond that of supportive sister-in-law. She personally directed strategic planning, maintained correspondence with potential allies throughout Italy, and provided the political vision that unified diverse opposition groups under a single banner. The siege of Perugia became a test of wills between 2 incompatible visions of Rome's future: Octavian's emerging autocracy that promised stability through submission to imperial authority, and Fulvia's more radical populism that championed property rights and constitutional governance against triumviral tyranny. As winter closed around the hilltop city where she had established her headquarters, Fulvia found herself commanding a desperate defensive campaign against an enemy who possessed superior resources but lacked the moral authority that came from defending ordinary citizens against elite oppression. The military details of the siege reveal both Fulvia's capabilities and the ultimate limitations of her position. She demonstrated genuine strategic intelligence in choosing defensive positions, maintaining morale among besieged troops, and coordinating with relief forces that might have broken Octavian's encirclement. But she also faced the inherent disadvantage of any rebel leader fighting against established authority. Her enemies could afford to wait while her supporters starved, and every day of prolonged resistance increased the likelihood that potential allies would abandon her cause in favor of accommodation with victorious power. When Perugia finally surrendered in early 40 BCE, Fulvia's defeat marked more than just the end of a particular military campaign. It represented the collapse of the last serious challenge to Octavian's consolidation of supreme power. Her exile to Greece removed from Roman politics the one woman who had proven capable of mobilizing popular opposition to triumviral authority, leaving the field clear for the future Augustus to complete his transformation of the Republic into an empire governed by hereditary succession, rather than electoral competition. As Fulvia departed Italy under the terms of her negotiated surrender, she carried with her the knowledge that she had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history. Even in defeat, she had proven that women could exercise direct political authority, command military loyalty, and challenge the most powerful men of their generation on equal terms. Fulvia died alone in Sicyon while couriers carried news across the Mediterranean that her husband Mark Antony had married Octavian's sister Octavia, sealing a political alliance that erased her from history with the stroke of a diplomatic pen. The woman who had commanded legions, burned senate houses, and wielded power that made senators tremble, found herself reduced to a footnote in other people's ambitions. Her revolutionary career dismissed as an inconvenient obstacle to masculine reconciliation. At 43, she had lived long ago and achieved more than most Roman men of her generation. But in death, she became what Roman women were always supposed to be: silent, invisible, and ultimately irrelevant to the grand narratives that men wrote about themselves. The exile to Greece had been presented as temporary banishment, a face-saving gesture that would allow Fulvia to retreat from politics while Antony negotiated his position within the triumvirate. She had accepted the terms with the dignity of someone who understood that strategic withdrawal might preserve options for future campaigns, but the months in Sicyon revealed the extent to which her power had always depended on proximity to Roman political networks that could not be maintained from distant provinces. Without access to the urban crowds who had served as her political infantry, without the ability to influence legislation through personal lobbying, and without the daily opportunities to build alliances that sustained all successful Roman careers, Fulvia found herself transformed from major player into interested observer of events she could no longer control. The letters she received from supporters in Rome painted a picture of rapid political realignment that made her exile seem increasingly permanent rather than temporary. Octavian's victory in the Perusine War had established him as the dominant figure in Italian politics, while Antony's prolonged absence in the East suggested either deliberate abandonment of Roman responsibilities or dangerous entanglement with foreign influences that could be exploited by domestic enemies. The triumvirate that had emerged from Caesar's assassination was evolving into something resembling conventional monarchy, with power concentrated among fewer hands and dissent increasingly treated as treason rather than legitimate political opposition. News of Antony's relationship with Cleopatra reached Sicyon through the efficient gossip networks that connected Roman aristocrats across the Mediterranean world. But Fulvia received these reports with the weary resignation of someone who had always understood that political marriages serve strategic rather than romantic purposes. Her own relationships with Clodius, Curio, and Antony had been calculated alliances designed to advance shared agendas rather than expressions of personal devotion. and she expected no different treatment from men who viewed wives as expendable assets in their pursuit of supreme power. What stung was not romantic betrayal, but political abandonment. Antony's willingness to sacrifice their partnership for the convenience of Egyptian wealth and Alexandrian luxury. The marriage announcement that arrived in late 40 BCE represented the final confirmation that Fulvia's political career had ended with her military defeat. Antony's union with Octavia served multiple strategic purposes. It cemented his reconciliation with Octavian, provided him with a respectable Roman wife whose moral reputation could counter criticism about his Eastern entanglements, and eliminated any obligation to defend or retrieve the inconvenient spouse whose revolutionary activities had embarrassed the triumvirate. Fulvia understood immediately that she had become a liability too dangerous to support and too prominent to simply ignore. Her death would solve problems for everyone involved in reshaping the Roman world according to masculine priorities. The final months of her life unfolded with the inevitable tragedy of someone who had challenged systems too powerful to reform and outlived her usefulness to the men who had initially found her dangerous capabilities valuable. Her health, undermined by years of political stress and the physical demands of military campaigning, began to fail in ways that suggested either natural illness or more deliberate intervention. Ancient sources remain deliberately vague about the specific causes of her decline, but the timing of her death, just as Antony's new marriage arrangements required her permanent removal from political consideration, struck contemporary observers as remarkably convenient for all parties concerned. Even in death, Fulvia's influence continued to shape Roman politics in ways that her male contemporaries found both instructive and threatening. Her career had demonstrated that women could exercise direct political authority rather than indirect influence, that popular support could be mobilized around constitutional principles rather than personal loyalty, and that the Republic's traditional gender hierarchies represented artificial limitations rather than natural law. Future empresses would operate in her shadow, using precedents she had established while carefully avoiding the revolutionary implications that had made her too dangerous for a world transitioning toward hereditary monarchy. The coins that bore her image, scattered across Mediterranean trade routes, provided the only lasting monument to a woman who had proven that Roman politics could accommodate female leadership if society possessed the courage to acknowledge what it had witnessed. But courage was precisely what the emerging imperial system could not afford. Fulvia's memory had to be buried along with her body, transformed from inspiration into cautionary tale, ensuring that no future woman would dare to claim the authority she had seized through intelligence, audacity, and absolute refusal to accept the limitations that tradition imposed on her gender. Her death marked not just the end of an individual life, but the closing of possibilities that would remain sealed for centuries, waiting for another revolution to break them open. A Philip Randolph stood before the Lincoln Memorial at dawn, its marble columns bathed in the golden light of a Washington summer morning, and envisioned 100,000 Americans filling the space between the monument and the Washington Monument, with voices demanding justice that could no longer be ignored or delayed. At 74, the veteran labor organizer had spent 5 decades fighting for workers' rights and racial equality. But this vision represented something more audacious than anything he had previously attempted. A mass demonstration that would force the nation to confront the systematic oppression that had persisted for a century after emancipation, transforming the symbolic heart of American democracy into a stage for the country's most urgent moral reckoning. The idea of a march on Washington had haunted Randolph's imagination since the 1940s, when he had first proposed a similar demonstration to pressure President Franklin Roosevelt into desegregating the defense industry. That earlier march had been called off after Roosevelt capitulated and signed Executive Order 8802, but the victory had been incomplete, addressing wartime labor needs while leaving the broader structure of American apartheid intact. Now, in the summer of 1963, with civil rights protests erupting across the South and television cameras broadcasting images of police dogs attacking children to living rooms across America, Randolph sensed that the moment had finally arrived for the massive, peaceful demonstration that could break the deadlock between justice and expedience that had paralyzed federal action on civil rights. The America that surrounded the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 remained a nation of two distinct realities, one visible and one carefully hidden from white consciousness. In the visible America, prosperity and freedom flourished as never before in human history, with suburbs expanding, highways connecting distant cities, and opportunities multiplying for families willing to work hard and play by established rules. But the hidden America, experienced daily by 20 million black citizens, remained trapped in a parallel universe where segregation laws denied access to public facilities, economic discrimination limited employment opportunities, and voting restrictions maintained political powerlessness that rendered constitutional rights meaningless in practice. Randolph's vision extended beyond simple protest into something approaching political revolution, a peaceful uprising that would demonstrate the moral bankruptcy of American racial policies, while showcasing the discipline and dignity of citizens who had been denied full participation in their own democracy. He understood that success would require more than righteous anger or even mass participation. It would demand the kind of careful planning and strategic coordination that could transform spontaneous emotion into sustained political pressure. The march had to be large enough to command national attention, peaceful enough to maintain moral authority, and focused enough to produce concrete legislative results rather than merely symbolic gestures. The civil rights movement of 1963 had reached a critical juncture where dramatic action could either accelerate progress toward equality or trigger violent backlash that would set the cause back for decades. The Birmingham campaign earlier that year had succeeded in desegregating that city's public facilities, but only after weeks of confrontations that had filled jails with protesters and hospital emergency rooms with victims of police brutality. President John F. Kennedy had finally introduced comprehensive civil rights legislation, but the bill faced determined opposition from Southern Democrats, who controlled key congressional committees and could delay action indefinitely through procedural maneuvering. Randolph's strategic genius lay in recognizing that the civil rights movement needed to expand beyond its traditional focus on Southern segregation, to address the economic inequalities that oppressed Black Americans throughout the country. The march, he envisioned, would demand not only an end to legal discrimination, but also federal action on unemployment, housing, and education, issues that affected every Black family, regardless of geographic location. By linking civil rights to economic justice, the demonstration could appeal to labor unions, religious organizations, and progressive political groups that might remain indifferent to purely racial concerns, but could be mobilized around broader questions of social justice. The planning sessions that followed Randolph's initial proposal revealed both the promise and the peril of attempting to coordinate a coalition that included organizations with fundamentally different philosophies and tactical approaches. The NAACP favored legal challenges and legislative lobbying, while the Southern Christian Leadership Conference emphasized nonviolent direct action and spiritual transformation. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had grown increasingly militant in response to violent attacks on peaceful protesters, while the Urban League focused on economic development and professional advancement for Black Americans. Each organization brought essential resources to the coalition, but their competing priorities threatened to fragment the movement just as it approached its moment of greatest opportunity. As news of the planned march began circulating through black communities across America, Randolph watched with satisfaction as enthusiasm built among ordinary citizens who had grown tired of waiting for change that seemed perpetually postponed. Churches began organizing bus transportation, labor unions pledged financial support, and celebrities offered to lend their voices to the cause. The march was becoming something larger than any single organization could control, or any individual leader could claim credit for. A spontaneous expression of collective determination that would either transform American society or reveal the limits of peaceful protest in a nation built on the systematic exclusion of its black citizens. The empty microphone that would soon amplify voices demanding freedom stood silent in the morning light, waiting for the moment when American conscience would finally be forced to listen. Bayard Rustin hunched over his cluttered desk in the cramped Harlem office that served as mission control for the March on Washington. Surrounded by rotary phones that rang constantly, stacks of permits that required immediate attention, and the ever-present awareness that his personal life could be weaponized to destroy the entire civil rights movement if his enemies chose to make it an issue. At 51, the openly gay activist had spent decades perfecting the art of operating in shadows, providing strategic expertise to more publicly acceptable leaders, while knowing that his sexual orientation made him perpetually vulnerable to the kind of scandal that could shatter fragile coalitions and derail carefully orchestrated campaigns for social justice. The challenge of organizing a demonstration for potentially 250,000 people in 8 weeks would have seemed impossible to anyone lacking Rustin's unique combination of logistical genius and absolute commitment to nonviolent revolution. Every detail required careful coordination. Transportation for thousands of buses and trains, converging on Washington from across the country. Sound systems powerful enough to reach the farthest corners of the National Mall. Food and water for crowds that might exceed the population of many American cities. Medical facilities prepared for heat exhaustion and potential violence, and security arrangements that would prevent the kind of incidents that could transform peaceful demonstration into public relations disaster. Rustin's experience with mass organizing stretched back to his participation in the first Freedom Ride in 1947, when he had been arrested and sentenced to a chain gang for challenging segregation on interstate transportation. His study of Mahatma Gandhi's tactics in India had taught him that successful nonviolent campaigns required discipline that bordered on military precision, with every participant trained in proper responses to provocation, and every logistical detail planned to minimize chaos that opponents could exploit. The March on Washington would succeed or fail based on Rustin's ability to apply these lessons to the largest civil rights demonstration in American history. The political tensions surrounding Rustin's leadership role reflected the broader challenges facing a movement that had to maintain moral authority while operating in a society where personal scandals could obliterate years of careful progress. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. had previously threatened to publicize allegations about Rustin's relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. unless Rustin was removed from an earlier campaign, demonstrating how homophobia could be weaponized against the civil rights movement, even by its supposed allies. Now, as march organizers debated whether Rustin's expertise was worth the potential risks, they confronted the uncomfortable reality that their own prejudices might undermine their pursuit of justice for another oppressed group. The logistical complexity that Rustin managed from his Harlem headquarters extended far beyond simple crowd control into the realm of political theater designed to maximize impact on both participants and television audiences. He coordinated with railroad companies to ensure that trains arriving from the South would be met by volunteers who could direct passengers toward the staging areas, worked with bus companies to establish parking zones that would prevent traffic gridlock from paralyzing downtown Washington, and negotiated with Park Services to provide adequate bathroom facilities for crowds that would dwarf anything the Capitol had previously accommodated. The controversy over John Lewis's original speech threatened to fracture the carefully constructed unity that had made the march possible, revealing how differences in tactical approach and generational perspective could explode into public conflict, even among organizations committed to the same fundamental goals. Lewis, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had prepared remarks that explicitly criticized the Kennedy administration's Civil Rights Bill as inadequate and called for more radical action than older leaders considered politically wise. The debate over his speech content took place just hours before the march was scheduled to begin, with Rustin serving as mediator between competing visions of how militant the movement should appear to white audiences. Rustin's solution to the speech controversy demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had made him indispensable despite his personal vulnerabilities. Rather than simply censoring Lewis's remarks or allowing them to proceed unchanged, he facilitated negotiations that preserved the young activist's right to express frustration with gradualist approaches while removing language that might alienate potential allies in Congress and the media. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but allowed the march to proceed with unified messaging that emphasized shared goals rather than tactical differences. As August 28 dawned clear and warm, Rustin surveyed the culmination of 8 weeks of 18-hour days spent coordinating details that ranged from celebrity transportation to sandwich distribution. The buses and trains were arriving on schedule. The sound systems had been tested and retested. The medical stations were staffed and supplied, and the security arrangements had been coordinated with federal authorities who remained nervous about potential violence. Everything that human planning could accomplish had been accomplished, but the success of the march would ultimately depend on factors beyond anyone's control: the behavior of crowds, the response of opponents, and the willingness of America to listen to voices that had been systematically silenced for centuries. Rustin's clipboard, filled with schedules and contact information that represented months of painstaking preparation, would soon become a historical artifact as spontaneous moments replaced planned programming, and the March on Washington transformed from logistical exercise into spiritual experience that would reshape American consciousness in ways that no amount of advanced planning could have anticipated. At 6 o'clock on the morning of August 28, 1963, trains and buses began converging on Washington, D.C., like tributaries flowing into a mighty river, carrying 250,000 Americans who had traveled from every corner of the country to participate in what they sensed would be either the greatest peaceful demonstration in the nation's history or a catastrophic confrontation that could set back the cause of civil rights for decades. The early arrivals gathered at the Washington Monument as the sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky, their faces reflecting the mixture of hope and apprehension that characterized people participating in an event whose outcome remained entirely unpredictable despite months of careful planning. The diversity of the crowd defied every stereotype about civil rights activism being limited to Southern black churches or radical college students, revealing instead a cross-section of American society that included factory workers from Detroit, teachers from Chicago, farmers from Mississippi, clergy from New York, and families from small towns whose names appeared on no national maps, but whose citizens had decided that this moment demanded their presence. White participants stood alongside black demonstrators. Young activists mingled with elderly supporters, and people wearing their finest Sunday clothes marched next to those dressed in work shirts and overalls that testified to their determination to attend regardless of economic circumstances. Martha Jenkins had ridden the overnight bus from Birmingham with her 3 children, using money she had saved from her job cleaning white families' homes, to purchase tickets that represented both financial sacrifice and profound act of faith in the possibility of change. She had lived through the spring campaigns that desegregated Birmingham's lunch counters and public facilities, had watched police dogs attack children not much older than her own, and had decided that bearing witness to this historic gathering was worth whatever risks might accompany their participation. As she walked toward the Lincoln Memorial with thousands of other pilgrims, she felt the weight of generations who had died without seeing this day, and the responsibility to ensure that her children would inherit a different America than the one that had constrained her own possibilities. The careful choreography that Bayard Rustin had planned over months of 18-hour days began to unfold with remarkable precision as marshals wearing white armbands directed the growing crowds toward designated gathering areas. Sound trucks provided information about the day's schedule, and volunteer medical teams established first aid stations, prepared for heat exhaustion in what promised to be sweltering August weather. The logistics of managing 250,000 people without serious incident required coordination that bordered on military precision. But the peaceful efficiency with which the demonstration proceeded stood as testimony to both careful planning and the disciplined commitment of participants who understood that any violence could be exploited to discredit their cause. Television cameras captured images that would be broadcast into American living rooms throughout the day, providing millions of viewers with their first glimpse of the civil rights movement as something more than news footage of confrontations and arrests. The cameras revealed ordinary Americans engaged in extraordinary acts of civic participation. Families sharing picnic lunches on the National Mall, children playing games while their parents listened to speeches, and crowds that remained remarkably orderly despite their size and the emotional intensity of the issues being addressed. These images challenged prevailing narratives about civil rights demonstrators as dangerous radicals threatening social stability, instead presenting a movement that embodied the highest ideals of American democracy. The program that began at noon featured speakers representing every major civil rights organization, labor leaders who had committed their unions to supporting racial equality, and religious figures whose moral authority transcended denominational boundaries. A. Philip Randolph, the march's principal organizer, opened the proceedings with remarks that situated the day's events within the broader context of struggles for economic justice that affected all working Americans regardless of race. John Lewis, despite the controversy over his original prepared text, delivered a speech that captured the impatience of young activists while maintaining the unity that had made the march possible. Entertainment interspersed with political speeches provided emotional punctuation that transformed the demonstration from mere protest into cultural celebration of African American resilience and creativity. Mahalia Jackson's gospel performance moved thousands to tears with spiritual power that seemed to sanctify the political gathering, while Bob Dylan and Joan Baez represented the growing alliance between civil rights activism and the emerging folk music movement that was attracting young white supporters to the cause. These artistic contributions helped sustain crowd energy throughout the long August afternoon, while demonstrating that the movement encompassed cultural as well as political dimensions. As the afternoon progressed and the crowd grew larger rather than smaller, despite the heat, participants began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in American history. The peaceful gathering of so many citizens demanding racial justice represented a form of direct democracy that transcended normal electoral politics, creating a moral community that existed for this single day, but whose influence would resonate through subsequent decades. The signs carried by demonstrators, "Jobs and freedom, we march for civil rights now. Equal rights for all Americans," articulated demands that seemed simultaneously radical and utterly reasonable, challenging a nation to live up to ideals it had proclaimed but never fully implemented. The stage was set for the climactic moment that would transform the March on Washington from successful demonstration into defining moment of American moral awakening, as one man prepared to articulate a vision of racial reconciliation that would echo through history. "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Mahalia Jackson's voice rang out from behind the podium as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reached the conclusion of his prepared remarks. And in that moment of divine inspiration, he set aside the carefully crafted text that his advisors had labored over for hours and began to speak from the depths of his soul about a vision of America that transcended the brutal realities of 1963 and reached toward possibilities that seemed almost impossibly distant from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The crowd of 250,000 people, which had listened respectfully to a dozen speakers throughout the long August afternoon, suddenly leaned forward with the collective anticipation of an audience sensing that they were about to witness something transcendent. King had arrived at this moment through a lifetime of preparation that included theological training at Crozer Seminary, doctoral studies at Boston University, leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott, and countless sermons delivered to congregations that had taught him how to weave together biblical imagery, constitutional principles, and personal testimony into rhetorical tapestries that could move hearts as effectively as they engaged minds. But standing before the largest civil rights audience ever assembled, with television cameras broadcasting his words to millions of Americans watching from their living rooms, he felt the weight of representing not just his own organization or even the broader movement, but the hopes of generations who had lived and died without seeing their dreams of equality realized. The speech began with prepared remarks that situated the march within the historical context of unfulfilled promises stretching back to the Emancipation Proclamation, describing how 100 years later, the Negro is still not free and remains crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. King's voice carried the authority of a preacher who had spent years developing the kind of rhythmic delivery that could transform political rhetoric into spiritual experience, using repetition and crescendo to build emotional intensity while maintaining intellectual coherence that would satisfy both immediate audience and future historians analyzing his words for deeper meaning. But when Mahalia Jackson's spontaneous encouragement reached his ears, King made the decision that would transform his appearance from successful speech into historical watershed. He had delivered variations of the dream sequence in previous sermons, most notably at a rally in Detroit earlier that summer. But never before such a massive audience or with such momentous stakes, riding on his ability to articulate a vision of racial reconciliation that could inspire continued struggle while offering hope for eventual success. Setting aside his written text, he began to improvise from the depths of faith and experience that had sustained him through years of death threats, jail cells, and the grinding daily work of challenging a system designed to resist change. "I have a dream," he declared, and the phrase became a refrain that structured the most memorable portion of American political oratory since Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Each repetition built upon the previous one, creating a literary and emotional architecture that moved from specific injustices to universal aspirations, from current realities to future possibilities, from the particular struggles of African Americans to the broader human quest for dignity and recognition. The dream sequence encompassed visions of former slaves and slave owners sitting together at tables of brotherhood, of his own children being judged by character rather than color, of transformation that would turn even Mississippi into an oasis of freedom and justice. The crowd's response intensified with each iteration of the dream theme, as 250,000 voices joined in spontaneous affirmation of a vision that seemed to offer redemption, not just for America's racial sins, but for the broader human capacity to transcend historical limitations through moral courage and sustained commitment to justice. Television cameras captured faces throughout the audience that reflected the kind of emotional catharsis typically associated with religious revival meetings rather than political rallies, suggesting that King had succeeded in transforming a demonstration for civil rights into something approaching spiritual awakening for both participants and viewers. The climactic conclusion drew upon the spiritual tradition that had sustained African Americans through centuries of oppression, as King quoted from "My Country 'Tis of Thee," before pivoting to the imagery of an old Negro spiritual that promised eventual liberation. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The words seemed to echo across the National Mall with the force of prophecy, offering both benediction for the day's events and challenge for the work that would be required to transform rhetorical vision into social reality. As the applause thundered across the memorial grounds and television commentators struggled to find adequate language for what they had just witnessed, King stepped back from the podium, knowing that he had articulated something that transcended the immediate political goals of the march to touch deeper currents of American conscience and possibility. The speech would be analyzed, quoted, and commemorated for decades to come, but in that moment, it served its most important function, providing a shared vocabulary for imagining an America where the color of one's skin would no longer determine the content of one's opportunities, where justice would flow like mighty waters, and where the dream of equality would finally become reality rather than aspiration. And there you have it. From medieval peasants sharing straw beds with mice and strangers, to Fulvia commanding Roman legions in defiance of every rule her society imposed, to the 250,000 Americans who gathered on that sweltering August day to demand a dream that seemed impossible until it wasn't. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders that the way we live now, our 8-hour sleep schedules, our assumptions about who gets to hold power, our beliefs about what's possible when ordinary people decide they've had enough, all of it was shaped by people who refused to accept that this is just how things are. If you found yourself staying awake tonight thinking about Thomas and Agnes sharing their sacred watch, or Fulvia rewriting the rules of Roman politics with nothing but audacity and intelligence, or Martin Luther King turning a political rally into a spiritual awakening that still echoes today, then you might be exactly the kind of person who appreciates history that doesn't put you to sleep. These stories aren't finished. They're still being written by everyone who decides that comfort zones are overrated and that the most interesting chapters of human experience happen when someone says, "What if we tried something completely different?" I've got more stories like these waiting in the wings. Tales of people who slept with their enemies, fought wars that changed everything, and dreamed dreams that became reality against all odds. But I can only keep telling them if you let me know they're worth your time. So if tonight's journey through medieval bedchambers and revolutionary moments grabbed your attention, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove truth really is stranger, more inspiring, and infinitely more fascinating than fiction. Sweet dreams, and remember, your ancestors survived some truly wild sleeping arrangements. So whatever's keeping you awake tonight probably isn't that bad in comparison.